Welcome to 5 After Midnight, True Stories of the Paranormal. One.
When I was a little kid, I would sometimes stay on the farm with my grandparents. My grandfather was a creature of habit, and he would always get up at 5 a.m., walk past me as I usually slept on the lounge and the floorboards would creak. He would go into the kitchen and turn on the light and start to get a cooked breakfast ready, etc. He'd do all of this in pitch black darkness. One morning, I hear him walk down the hall, come into the lounge, but instead of going into the kitchen, he stopped in the lounge and stood there. I hear him shuffling, and I half open my eyes, and I'm thinking, what's Papa up to? I open my eyes fully and stare into the blackness. I see nothing, but I still hear him swaying from foot to foot. Creak, creak, creak. My eyes start to adjust and I see what I think is his outline. I still hear him shifting his weight. Creak, creak, creak. Right then I hear a noise down the hallway. Someone starts walking down the hall, right past me, into the kitchen and turns on the light. In the darkness, I hear my grandfather ask why I'm awake before him. I tell him I think I heard something, and Papa asked if he could turn on the kitchen light because it would make things easier on him. He never has before, but I leapt at the chance. The light comes on, I see nothing, and then I fall back asleep in the matter of minutes.
Two.
I had always known that my father's best friend died in his sophomore year of college because of a drug overdose. The year was 1967, and someone had made some kind of speed derivative in the chemistry lab. My father's best friend, Greg, had taken it on an empty stomach and had an instant heart attack. They lived together in a dorm called Thorson Hall. He had offered it to my dad first, and my dad said he was too busy to get high, and it kind of gives me chills knowing my dad could have died that night. He listened to Led Zeppelin and Beethoven, especially when he was high. 40 years later, I go to the same college my dad attended. It was freshman year, first semester, when the dean of students made his annual ghost story tour of the dorms. He collects ghost stories ever since 2 female students came to his office and proceeded to tell him the following story. For all of first semester, sometime in the early 90s, one of the girls would see a little boy wearing a red hat sit around their dorm in Thorson Hall. Amanda would wake up the other roommates by screaming, and the other roommate, Belle, never saw the little red hat boy. Belle was beginning to think Amanda was crazy, and Amanda was beginning to think she was going crazy. This was around the time CD players first came out. Every CD worked fine on the player, but for some reason, whenever they put in a Beethoven or Led Zeppelin CD, it would skip to particular tracks. By this time in the story, I was kind of freaking out. It sounded really similar to my father's story, but I kept listening. My father's friend died when he was 19 or 20, and this was a little boy they were seeing. Anyway, fall break comes and Amanda goes home to relax. Belle stayed in the dorm. One evening she went to bed early. The next day she was in the bathroom when one of her friends came into the bathroom and asked her who the little boy was sitting on her bed. Keep in mind, these 2 girls never told anyone except the dean about this, in fear that someone would think they were crazy. Belle finally believed Amanda. The little red hat boy eventually went away when they asked him to leave them alone. A student asked after hearing the story, "But why would a little ghost boy be in a campus dorm?" The dean responded that he wasn't sure, but ghosts don't always come back at that age that they died. Sometimes they come back as little kids, sometimes at the age that they died, etc. I called my father after hearing the dean's collection of ghost stories, and I asked him to tell me more about Greg. He said Greg was a bigger guy, nice, friendly, liked the top 40, invested in his friends. Oh no, yeah, he wore a red hat. I froze. Later I talked to the dean about it, and we think the ghost might just be my father's dead best friend.
3.
Last summer, when I was house sitting for my neighbors, some really weird stuff went down. My family lives in a neighborhood kind of out of our means, so usually the summers we're the only ones left on the street while everyone else is on vacation. The last few summers, my across-the-street neighbors paid me to house sit and cat sit for them, which is fine because the cat is one fat, sassy cat. Anyway, I've always found their basement creepy because there's no main source of light, just floor lamps. But I suck it up because that's where all the cat stuff is. Anyway, they have an alarm system, so me being all conscientious, I arm it every day, lock the door, which needs some force to close, then double check the door to make certain it's completely shut. Everything's normal the first day. The second day, though, I go to check on the house and the front door is unlocked. The next day, still creeped out from the door being unlocked, I grab a crowbar from my garage before going up to my neighbor's house. The door is unlocked again, so I resolve to call the cops when I get in. Well, I completely forget that I was going to call the cops. I'm chilling in my bed at 1 a.m. that same night and the doorbell rings. Luckily, the police were doing a routine sweep of the neighborhood anyway and found my neighbor's door unlocked, so I go over with them to check the house. They're checking all the rooms on each floor with huge flashlights, really combing over that creepy basement. Nothing there though, but I decide to do a test. As we're leaving the house, I'm the last one out, so I leave the kitchen light on, come out and lock the door. One cop even double checks it for me to make sure that it's locked. Luckily, this is the last night that the neighbors are out. The next morning is the last time I have to check on the cat, and I bring my crowbar again. Now this is what's even weirder. This time the door is still locked, but when I get in, the kitchen light that I left on is switched off again. I hurried up feeding the cat and got out of there. When my neighbors got home that afternoon, I went over again to tell them about it, trying to laugh it off and not alarm them too much, and they mostly shrugged it off. I still have no idea what was going on. At first I thought maybe one of the other neighbors also had a spare key, but my family was the only one in the neighborhood. I'm not house sitting there again next summer.
4.
I was obviously too young at the time to remember any of this, but my parents told me about it, and my older brother and sister both confirm it. When I was just under 2 years old, we started renting a crappy, tiny little house out in the boonies. Shortly after we moved in, I started having awful nightmares, something I'd never suffered before. I would wake up screaming, "Fireman! Fireman!" and point out the window. Obviously, since we were in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, there were no firemen outside, nor did my parents recall me ever being scared by sirens, fires, or firemen before. The nightmares and fear were new and inexplicable. We moved a lot back then, and we did not live in the house for more than 5 or 6 months. But I had the nightmares consistently the whole time we lived there, and after we moved, they stopped completely. Years later, we moved again to another town 30 or so minutes away. My mom stayed friendly with several people from the small town we'd moved from, and was visiting one of them one day. Somehow the topic turned to the house that we rented, and my mom mentioned how it hadn't been a great place to live for a lot of reasons, but she also happened to mention my nightmares. The woman she was visiting was horrified and proceeded to tell my mom that the previous owner of the home had been a raging alcoholic who had either accidentally or intentionally set himself on fire after building a campfire in the side yard. He died from his injuries. The place where he had burned to death was the same place I pointed to every time I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't terrified of the firemen. I was terrified of the fireman. The one I somehow saw outside the house every single night, self-immolating. This happened when I was 7 years old. My dog had just died, and I was lying awake in bed at 2 to 3 a.m. I also had just gotten this toy robot dog that you could control with a remote, and it made it sit, etc. Although I hadn't tried it yet since we didn't have AA batteries. Well, I suddenly heard this squeaking noise, and I look over and see it on my dresser walking towards me. It fell off the dresser and rolled over and continued walking towards me. I was extremely freaked out. Suddenly, my dad comes in with a baseball bat, thinking that someone broke into our house. The toy dog just fell over and turned itself off. I would have thought this whole saga of events was a dream if my dad had not been there to witness it. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the show. If you have a story to share, send us an email, like us on Facebook, share, like, and subscribe.